You checked out and saw 4 payments of $37.50 interest-free, and for a half second, it felt like you beat the system. That's not an accident. That feeling was manufactured, tested, optimized, and deployed at scale specifically against you. Right now, 47% of Americans under 35 used BNPL in the past year. The industry went from $24 billion in transactions in 2022 over $160 billion by 2024, not because it's convenient, but because it works. Not for us, against us. We are carrying $1.7 trillion in student debt, looking at housing that costs 400% more than it did for our parents. Watching wages that haven't moved meaningfully in 40 years, and now there's a button at checkout that makes all of it feel manageable. That button isn't a solution, it's the newest layer of the same trap. And the mechanism behind it, the actual design, the actual beneficiary, the actual math, is far more calculated than anything you've been shown yet. The generation before us entered the workforce when a minimum wage job could cover rent, not comfortably, but mathematically. In 1975, the median home price was 3.7 times the median annual income. Today, it's 7.5 times and still climbing. A boomer, with the same job title as a Gen Z worker today, paid roughly $1,200 for a 4-year degree. We paid $37,000. They were handed company pensions, fixed benefit retirement plans, and mortgages at rates their incomes could actually support. We were handed a 401k, which means we were handed the market's risk and told to figure it out. The gap isn't generational failure, it's policy. Deliberate, documented, traceable to specific legislative decisions made between 1978 and 2008 that systematically shifted financial risk from institutions onto individuals, from employers onto workers, from banks onto borrowers. That transfer was already complete before most of us got our first paycheck. Then wages stopped moving. Not slowed, stopped. Real wages for the bottom 60% of American earners grew less than 0.5% annually between 1979 and 2020. Meanwhile, rent increased 149% above inflation since 1985. Healthcare costs tripled in real terms. Childcare rose from 7% of family income in 1982 over 20% today. And through all of it, the advice stayed identical. Work harder, save more, cut the avocado toast. That advice wasn't ignorant. It was structurally cruel. A 1985 solution force-applied to a 2024 math problem, the shame was part of the design too. If you believe the gap is your fault, you don't look for who built it. And then, exactly when budgets became impossible, exactly when the distance between what we earn and what everything costs became undeniable, the frictionless button appeared. BNPL didn't create the desperation. It was engineered to monetize it, arriving precisely when our margins vanished. Let's be precise about who is in this room. On one side, Klarna, Affirm, Afterpay, and Zip collectively valued above $15 billion, processing over $160 billion in annual transactions by 2024. They earn 2 to 8% in merchant fees on every single purchase, plus late fees that hit 43% of their users at least once per year. Behind them sit the retail corporations that absorb that merchant fee without complaint. Because when BNPL is offered at checkout, average order value increases between 20 and 45%, meaning they spend less per transaction in fees and collect far more per customer. And then there are the lending partners nobody mentions. Affirm alone works with banks that charge between 10 and 36%. APR on plans quietly excluded from the 0% promotional framing. These aren't separate companies with separate interests. They are one interconnected revenue engine, and every dollar it generates flows from the same source. The moment we decided the $150 felt like $37.50, on the other side, us, median Gen Z earner, $42,000 before taxes, $2,660 after, already running a monthly deficit before a single BNPL plan enters the equation, carrying $1.7 trillion in aggregate student debt, renting at prices 149% above inflation, and now, statistically, 20% more likely to simultaneously carry revolving credit card debt if we use BNPL, not because we're reckless, but because the friction that would have stopped us was surgically removed. The system needs us to keep playing, not to win, to keep playing. A workforce that saves, waits, and delays consumption is a workforce that eventually stops depending on credit. That is the one outcome the entire architecture is designed to prevent. And the mechanism that makes prevention possible, the actual engineering decision that guarantees we keep spending past our means, is something you haven't seen yet. Because it doesn't live at checkout, it lives inside the price tag itself. Here's what never made it into a single classroom lesson we received. Compound interest is a weapon, and which side of it you're on determines everything. We were taught it builds wealth, Einstein's eighth wonder of the world, the thing that makes savings grow. But that's only half the sentence. The full sentence is, compound interest builds wealth for lenders and destroys it for borrowers. And BNPL is engineered to keep us on the wrong side without ever saying the word. Interest 23 states don't require personal finance education. The credit score system, the architecture that controls whether we can rent an apartment, buy a car, or eventually own a home, requires us to carry debt to build it. A savings account doesn't build our score. Only borrowed money, actively cycling, builds our score. That is not an oversight. That is the design. BNPL fits directly into that architecture. It normalizes multiple simultaneous obligations and trains us to treat debt as the baseline condition of adult life, before we ever understand what debt actually costs over time. And then the layers compound against each other. The U.S. tax code gives a deduction for mortgage interest. The government literally subsidizes asset-backed debt, but offers nothing for rent, nothing meaningful for student loan interest above $2,500. It rewards owning and penalizes the exact financial position our entire generation is currently locked into. Meanwhile, inflation functions as a continuous, invisible transfer of purchasing power from wage earners to asset holders. Between 2020 and 2023, cumulative inflation hit 20%. Median wages grew 13%. That 7% gap is structural extraction recurring annually, silently, regardless of how carefully we budget. These aren't separate traps, they are one trap with multiple entry points, each one compounding the next. And BNPL was engineered to slide into the precise gap they created the moment when the math stopped working and a split payment button appeared as the only visible solution. When you actually run those numbers across a decade, what they add up to doesn't look like a design flaw, it looks like a target. Let me show you the math. The median American worker earns $56,000 a year, not entry level, not minimum wage. The median after federal taxes at 24%, state taxes averaging 5%, and FICA at 7.65%, you take home roughly $35,400. That's $2,950 a month. It sounds workable until you line up what the actual economy charges for existing. Rent at the national median for renters under 35, $1,800. Healthcare, if you're not fully covered by an employer, $300. Student loan payment on the average, $37,000 balance at 6.5% over 10 years, $400. Groceries, utilities, transportation, phone, another $860. That's $3,360 in fixed obligations against $2,950 in take-home. You are mathematically underwater before you buy a single optional item. Before one BNPL plan enters the equation, the budget is already broken. That's not a lifestyle problem, that's the baseline. Now layer in the BNPL behavior the data actually shows. The average active user carries 3.1 simultaneous plans, not one, not two, 3.1, at an average split payment of $45 per plan per month. That's $139.50 added to a budget already $410 in the negative. 43% of users miss at least one payment per year, triggering average late fees of $15 per incident, small enough to feel trivial, large enough to stack. But here's the number that should follow you out of this video. BNPL users spend 20 to 45% more per transaction than they would have without the option. Apply the conservative 20% to the average Gen Z discretionary monthly spend of $380. And that's $76 in additional spending per month that wouldn't have happened if the pain hadn't been removed. Added up, $139 in plans, $76 in behavioral overspend, and a budget that was already negative. That's $625 a month in structural damage invisible at any individual checkout. Project that forward, and the number stops feeling abstract. $625 a month that doesn't exist in the budget but keeps getting spent. That's $7,500 a year. Over 5 years, that's $37,500 that didn't build an emergency fund, didn't reduce student debt, didn't compound anywhere. But here's where the math becomes something else entirely. If that $625 had been invested monthly at a historical 7% average annual return, it would be worth approximately $43,000 after 5 years and $217,000 after 20. Not through sacrifice, through stopping a behavioral leak that was engineered into existence without your consent. The median Gen Z renter is currently 14 years away from saving a standard 20% down payment on a median-priced home. Every BNPL plan running in the background doesn't just delay that number, it multiplies it. And that multiplication isn't accidental. It is the function the system was built to perform. Even if we cut every optional expense, no subscriptions, no dining out, no new clothes, the math still doesn't close. Apply maximum discipline to the median scenario, eliminate all discretionary spending, drop BNPL entirely, redirect every available dollar on $2,950 take-home with $2,550 in non-negotiable fixed costs. The theoretical maximum savings rate is $400 a month. A 20% down payment on the current median home price of $430,000 is $86,000. At $400 a month, that's 17.9 years away, and that's before home prices increase at their current annual rate of 6.1%. In 3 years of perfect discipline, the target doesn't hold at $86,000, it moves to $102,000. The $400 a month we sacrificed just to stay in the race is now $255 a month behind the finish line. We ran harder. The goalposts moved faster. This is not a math problem we can outwork. This is a ladder engineered to rise faster than we can climb it. This is where the anger arrives, not the hot anger of losing a game. But the cold clarity of understanding the game was never designed for us to win. We were told discipline was the variable, that if we managed behavior correctly, the math would eventually resolve in our favor. But the math was fixed before we arrived. Home prices indexed to asset holders who already owned wages indexed to shareholder return, not labor value. Credit scores built around borrowed money, not financial health. And now a split payment interface calibrated to the exact psychological gap between what we earn and what everything costs. Every layer was constructed before we entered the room. The message was, this system is meritocratic. The math says, this system is extractive. And the most dangerous part of the trap is not the debt it creates. It's the decade we spend believing the gap is our fault before we finally sit down and run the actual numbers. The system isn't broken. It's working exactly as designed. The architects of the rules we're playing by, the 401k risk transfer, the mortgage interest deduction, the credit score architecture, the BNPL merchant model, were not careless forecasters who missed these outcomes. They were precise engineers. They built a machine that performs one function reliably, transfers financial risk downward and financial return upward, compounded annually with no reversal mechanism inside the existing rules. The proof isn't in documents, it's in the outcomes. The top 10% of American households held 60% of all national wealth in 1989. By 2024, they hold 67%. That 7% shift took 35 years of compounding quietly while we were told the problem was our spending habits. Someone profits every time we miss the full calculation. Someone profits every time we feel $37.50 instead of $150. And now that the architecture is visible, the only question is what we choose to build inside of it. In the next 1 to 5 years, the numbers don't forgive experimentation. If you keep running 3 simultaneous BNPL plans on a budget already negative $90 before the first payment hits, your savings rate doesn't shrink. It mathematically cannot exist. Emergency funds require surplus. There is no surplus. One medical bill, one car repair, one missed paycheck. And there is nothing between you and a credit card at 22% APR, which is exactly where this architecture was always pointing. Meanwhile, Klarna and Affirm began full credit bureau reporting in 2023. Every missed payment is now a permanent mark on the score that controls whether you can rent a new apartment, qualify for a car loan, or ever touch a mortgage rate below 8%. The tool marketed as harmless is now writing your financial history. 78% of Gen Z already report chronic financial anxiety. This is not coincidence. This is what living inside a budget that was designed to fail feels like from the inside. Between 5 and 15 years out, the window that felt optional becomes a wall. The median Gen Z renter is already 14 years from a standard down payment under current conditions, and that calculation assumes no BNPL plans, no missed payments, and no behavioral overspend. Add the real numbers back in, and that window doesn't just delay, it disappears. Homeownership, which for every prior generation functioned as the single most reliable mechanism for building household wealth, exits the equation entirely. And without the asset appreciation that comes with ownership, the wealth gap between generations doesn't close, it compounds. Career calculus changes to you cannot negotiate salary, you cannot quit without another job lined up, you cannot take a risk on a startup or a pivot or a sabbatical when 3 payment plans are drafting your account on the first of every month. Financial precarity isn't just a money problem. It is a cage that controls every decision that touches money, which is every decision. At 15 to 30 years, the arithmetic of what was lost becomes irreversible. Retirement contributions that never started don't get caught up. Compound interest doesn't grant extensions. 1 decade of redirected spending, $200 a month absorbed by normalized debt instead of invested, represents approximately $87,000 in compounded growth at a historical 7% return. Gone. Not because of a crisis, but because of a checkout screen that made $150 feel like nothing. The psychological toll by this point isn't anxiety anymore, it's grief. The quiet recognition of a life spent running hard enough to stay in place on a treadmill that was calibrated to speed up faster than any individual effort could compensate for. 55% of Americans have less than $100,000 saved for retirement at age 55. They didn't fail to try. They failed to see the extraction happening in increments too small to feel at the point of sale. This is not personal failure. This is systematic extraction, documented, measurable, and designed to be invisible until the math finally becomes undeniable. Here's what changes when you finally see the board instead of just the pieces. The shame dissolves. Not because the situation improves, the math is still what it is, but because the cause is no longer invisible. We were handed a system designed to extract value upward and convinced that the gap between our effort and our outcome was a character flaw. It wasn't. It was the expected output of a machine running exactly as intended. The shift isn't about cutting up payment apps or avoiding credit entirely. It's about questioning the incentive behind every financial product before you use it, not is this convenient, but who profits when I use this, and what does it actually cost me? That single question, applied consistently, changes what you see at every checkout screen, every loan offer, every advice column telling you the problem is your discipline and never the design. We were never bad with money. We were handed tools built by people who profit when we misuse them and told that was guidance. This is hard. The system made it hard on purpose, but now you see it and you can't unsee it. Most people around you will keep feeling $37.50 instead of $150 for the rest of their financial lives, not because they're less intelligent, but because no one built the architecture of the trap into the explanation. You're not a victim now, you're a witness. You understand the incentive structure, the behavioral engineering, the credit framework built to reward borrowed money over saved money. That awareness doesn't fix the math overnight, but it changes every calculation going forward, and that compounds too. If BNPL was engineered to fill the gap between what we earn and what everything costs, the next question isn't about payment tools at all. It's about the credit score that controls your access to housing, employment, and capital, and whether it was ever measuring your financial health or simply your willingness to keep borrowing. The system isn't broken. It's working exactly as designed. The only thing that changes when you understand that is everything.